chapter 15, where we'll be talking about pox viruses. And I'm going to have this lecture split into at least two, possibly three videos, just to keep the file sizes a little bit smaller. In this first part, we'll talk about just real quick overview of taxonomy of pox viruses, and then I'll walk you through the clinical course of smallpox infection. And then in later parts, we'll go through kind of that molecular replication cycle and talk about some of the efforts that led to eradication of smallpox. All right, so if you're not that familiar with smallpox, since it thankfully does not exist today, it was arguably one of the worst plagues, viral plagues in human history. Had about a 30% mortality rate, which is quite high. Um, Individuals that were infected would be covered, especially their face and arms and legs, with this very dense rash. And the rash could leave you scarred, of course, but it would also leave a significant fraction of people blinded, even if they survived the virus. And so they estimate in the 18th century, smallpox was killing about 400,000 people every year in Europe. So significant human mortality linked to this virus. And we talked in some of the earlier chapters when we were discussing vaccines about the fact that, there has been some form of a smallpox vaccination around since the late 1700s when this English physician Jenner kind of first popularized the use of cowpox to provide some protection. But despite that, it was still a huge problem in the 20th century, so they estimate, hundreds of millions of people were killed in the 20th century alone due to smallpox. And even as recent as the 1950s, there were about 50 million cases worldwide each year. But thankfully, as I mentioned, by 1979, smallpox had been completely eradicated due to just massive vaccination efforts. And so in terms of the taxonomy of smallpox, there is a whole family of smallpox-related viruses, various species listed here. These all fall under the family Poxviridae. They're all in the subfamily Cordopoxvirinae, and then in the genus Orthopoxvirus. And you can see there's some unusual species here. There's like the camelpox, cowpox we've talked about being used in those early vaccination attempts, raccoon pox, etc. Some kind of weird ones. But the one that caused smallpox in humans was variola virus, marked here with the red arrow. And then in this chapter, we'll also bump into vaccinia virus, because that is the close relative that was used for the smallpox vaccine. And in fact, most of the research that is related to pox viruses has been carried out using vaccinia. So if you ever see a research article tied in with smallpox, it's probably dealing with that particular species. All of these different viruses would be cross-reactive in terms of immune response. And I did want to point out that variola only infects humans, right? It's got that very narrow host range, and that ties in with some of the eradication efforts later on. If you remember last chapter when we talked about poliovirus, right, one of the things that made it attractive for potential eradication is the fact that there's not an animal reservoir out there. So we have these two unique strains, either variola major or variola minor, that we'll get into a little bit later. My cat's sitting here yelling at me, so if you hear some meows, that's what's going on. All right, let's talk about clinical course of infection. So smallpox is the clinical condition that's caused by the variola virus. And that term variola dates back to 570 AD, derived from either varius or varus, meaning spotted or pimple, respectively. And it's obvious to see why those terms would be applied to this particular virus. In terms of its transmission, it can be airborne through large respiratory droplets, or you could contract smallpox by coming into direct contact with rash material, basically like scabs that had fallen off, which sounds pretty gross and arguably is gross, but those scabs are infectious. Um, Cases tend to peak in the colder months because the virus has been shown to be more stable at lower temperatures and at lower humidity levels, which of course you would find in the winter as well. Um, so at least in the lab, they find a pretty high percentage of aerosolized viral particles are inactivated within 24 hours. So, um, it's not going to hang around for weeks and weeks and weeks on a doorknob or something like that. However, virions that are found within those scabs that have fallen off an individual with smallpox have been shown to still be infectious for many years. So it could hang around in that form. All right, let's go through the clinical course here. So, of course, you start with your incubation period, which could be anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks. You'll get two viremias, a primary and a secondary, during that incubation period. And then that's going to be followed by the prodromal period, which will last 2 to 4 days, where you get those kind of non-specific symptoms again, like you always see in the prodromal. High fever could be quite high, up to 104, headache, backache, usually characterized by extreme exhaustion, weakness, called prostration, because you're going to be prostrate, just lying down, sometimes vomiting, sometimes abdominal pain, but nothing that would scream smallpox at that point. Um, and then the prodromal period is followed by a short, as short as 1 day, um, uh, period called the enanthem. And in this enanthem, so the fever has subsided, right? Most of those prodromal symptoms have started to go away. The individual's feeling better, but in this 1 day window, you'll get basically a rash, tiny little spots all over the tongue, and mucous membranes on the back of the throat. And so those little spots will kind of turn into lesions that will increase in size, eventually rupture, and the fluid that's released from those lesions contains a ton of virions, so people are very infectious during that period of time. And then that enanthem is followed by what's called the exanthem, and this could last up to about a month in length. And this is where you're going to get those distinctive pox, right? Pimples and lesions. Um, and you'll also see a return of in some cases, extremely high fever again during that exanthem period. And really, you'll note down here, right, individual is infectious basically from the end of the prodromal, so as soon as they have those lesions in the back of their throat, through till all the scabs are off their person. All right, so in terms of the exanthem and the characteristic pox, usually the lesions are going to start as what are called herald spots. Usually those will be on the face or on the forehead. Um, and then you're going to start getting more lesions on your arms, legs, some on your torso and trunk within a couple of days. But the lesion pattern you get with smallpox is what's called a centrifugal distribution. So it's almost as if you centrifuge the virus, out of the person's core, and it's all mostly out here in the extremities. The chickenpox rash, in contrast, is a centripetal distribution, so just the opposite, where most of the lesions are concentrated on the body core, on the trunk, um, rather than on the extremities. All right, so let's go through kind of the progress of the pox themselves. So as I mentioned, people are most infectious during that first week of the rash, right? Really high virus titer in their saliva, so it would be easily transmitted at that point. And you'll get these 4 stages of rash progression over the next couple of weeks. So you'll usually start with what are called macules, which would just be red spots. Those will progress into papules, so raised red bumps, or almost like beginnings of pimples. And you could have both of these in combination, which would be referred to as the maculopapular rash, excuse me. And then that will transition into vesicles, which is what you see on this young man here on the right. So these are going to be almost like blisters at that point, filled with fluid that's also going to contain large amount of virions. Um, Sometimes they'll almost look white in characteristic. I call them opalescent. Um, but usually at this stage, that fever is back, sometimes very high, 103, 104 in some cases. And in some individuals, you'll get what are called umbilicated vesicles. So there's basically kind of a central dimple in the middle. They can be almost really kind of hard. And this image of this poor young girl or boy here, I think it's a young girl. You can see on her arms some of these lesions are umbilicated, so you see a little dimple in the middle, also here, kind of under her armpit. But yeah, it just looks miserable, right? It looks horrible. Um, then those vesicles will progress into what are called pustules, so literally big pimples, essentially pus-filled lesions by about the end of that first week. And then those will gradually crust over and scab by the end of the second week. And then those scabs will start falling off. And as they fall off, they will usually leave depigmented scars. And in some cases, you'll get, more severe scarring like you would have with like cystic acne or something like that. Which you see on some people's face and back. All right, so that's taking us through that progression there. And again, just to remind you, right, most transmission is going to happen, um, related to the enanthem and the virions that are in the saliva earlier in the infection. Although, as I said, the scabs, the vesicles, basically anything coming out of those lesions, out of the rash, can still be infected. But it's less likely you're going to contract smallpox from a scab because it would have to penetrate your skin. So just touching somebody's scab with your finger is not going to give you smallpox. But if it came into contact with an open wound, or you hadn't washed your hands and then rubbed your eyes or something, potentially uh, you could contract it that way. Two different types of smallpox virions that you'll find during an infection. So you have on the right what's called the mulberry or the M form, so named because somebody thought it resembled a mulberry fruit, which is, if you're not familiar with that, it's kind of like a blackberry. And then you have the C form, capsular form on the left, which has a little bit more of a defined core. And typically in any infection, you're going to find the C form more predominant in the scabs, in the rash itself, and the M form is usually going to be in the fluid, so vesicular fluid, for example. I brought this up earlier. Two different types of variola major or minor, and of course major is so named because it's more severe. That's where you've got the up to about a 30% mortality rate, and usually individuals that were dying of smallpox were dying around day 10 to 16, so somewhere in that first couple of weeks. Variola minor, uh, significantly less severe, much lower mortality rate, but the overall progression of the disease was essentially the same. Right? So I think a lot of those pictures we were looking at, even though they looked horrible, were in many cases probably variola minor. Here's a couple of pictures of what variola major would frequently look like. And you could really get these two key symptoms that would indicate, yeah, this is really serious. Nurses that were tending to smallpox victims They could almost walk through the ward and pick out those individuals that were not going to make it just based on whether or not they had one of these two symptoms. So the first, which is shown up here in the top picture, is what's called flat smallpox, sometimes referred to as malignant smallpox. And you get what they describe as velvety vesicles that are kind of flush with the skin. So that's what you're seeing on the cheeks here. Um, Usually if you have these flat smallpox, you have a very high fever throughout the course of infection. And you couple that with people being dehydrated or not getting enough food because they've got those vesicles rupturing on the back of their throat, so it hurts to swallow. It's not a good combination in any way. And these malignant lesions can be so bad that you actually get big chunks of skin basically coming off, leaving you with wounds that would be similar to those experienced by a burn victim. Um, so very nasty. And on the bottom here, you see what are called hemorrhagic smallpox, again, characteristic of that variola major. So this is where you actually get bleeding into the skin or into the mucosal membranes and sometimes even in the gastrointestinal tract. So you can see here like these big, bruise-like rings around those smallpox lesions. So again, pretty scary, essentially bleeding internally there. All right, so I'm gonna stop here and we'll pick this up in the next video.